Welcome. Good afternoon. We're here in one of the fish tank sessions. We have a very interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about establishing strategies for sustainable aviation fuel success. And we have with us two very important gentlemen that are very involved in the promotion and development of sustainable aviation fuels worldwide. We have Chris Raymond from the Boeing Company. He is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Boeing Company. And we have Philippe Lacampe, who is the CEO of Sky Energy, one of the companies that has been at the forefront of distributing sustainable aviation fuel for a number of years. Hello, gentlemen. Hello. Welcome. We're going to start. I'm going to start by asking you, I heard recently that Boeing and Sky Energy have teamed up to, try to scale the supply and use of sustainable aviation fuel. So, what can you tell me about this announcement and about what you guys are doing?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with just how we got together. And one of the reasons we did the partnership with Sky Energy was that we've had a long relationship with Sky Energy, and we consider them to be one of the oldest, most focused companies on this technology of sustainable fuels. I think they've got a demonstrated track record of success. We've got a lot of personal relationships between our companies, and we really know they're focused on some of the right technologies. They've proven they can do it with some of the mature technologies, but they're very active in exploring the new technologies like alcohol to jet, and that was very important to us on the technology side as well.
Okay.
So, Lee?
Yeah, I'd just say, we were hugely honored when Boeing chose to partner with Sky Energy. It's been a decade of working together, and this really was a formalization of the relationship. What Sky Energy has been doing for the last decade is creating a demand, and what Boeing has done so effectively is amplified the reach. So as Chris says, one of the most important components of sustainable aviation fuel is the true sustainability of the feedstock. And that's the knowledge that Sky Energy brings, that's the expertise, and together we hope that we can really begin to drive the adoption, the broad adoption of sustainable aviation fuel.
Okay, we very clearly know that in order to fulfill the demand of jet fuel with sustainable aviation fuel, it's an enormous challenge. And so there's a need to make huge investments in this. What can you tell us about the advantages of using sustainable aviation fuel versus other types of technologies that are currently being talked about? For example, some people have talked about hydrogen, and there's a lot of buzz around hydrogen. So what can you tell us about, why is sustainable aviation fuel so important and why we need to invest in it?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's worth saying that hydrogen is important in sustainable aviation fuels generally. So green hydrogen is an essential component of sustainable aviation fuel. So actually, from that perspective, we're very keen to see the development of the hydrogen industry as well. So that's very important. As we were saying, the most important component is the true sustainability of the feedstock. And that, again, is where our studies and our expertise really lies. We're focused 100% on sustainable aviation fuel. That is really, we believe, the first and most important transitional technology to get us to a decarbonized aviation industry. And we certainly look to Boeing, who have done an enormous amount of work in other areas. That's their expertise. And Chris, perhaps over to you on
sure.
the technologies.
I agree with Philippe. We should all want more green hydrogen in the world because that would mean there's an abundance of renewable electricity in the world. And we all want that for multiple industries. I think in aerospace, we always think about these four areas. Something has to be technologically possible. You have to be able to safely certify it or qualify it for aviation. As I like to say, if a fuel doesn't work in a car, you pull off to the side of the road. If a fuel doesn't work in an airplane, that's a different issue. And so we have to be able to safely qualify these fuels. And then we have to deal with any infrastructure that may or may not need to change. And then finally, is the market case and the economic adoption of it. And so the reason the industry is focused on these fuels is we're sort of through the first three buckets there. We know we can technologically do it. We know we can qualify it Very little infrastructure change has to occur, but we're in the tough part now of scaling this industry up and industrializing it and drawing capital to the industry. And so I think that's why it's very important that companies are working together and that we're working with governments to get the right incentivizing policies in place that will attract capital to companies like Sky Energy and the projects that they're looking to industrialize to a larger degree.
Very interesting. I think that, for the benefit of the people that are listening to us, can you give us some examples, some concrete examples? Because sustainable aviation fuel is, somewhat of a complex, simple but complex topic. So can you give us some examples of how do you make these fuels? How are these fuels produced?
Yeah, for sure. I'll lead off. First of all, is understanding what are feedstocks for a lot of people. And feedstocks can be really any waste stream. So we're looking at agricultural waste, forest residues, oils and fats, and then, of course, we're looking at this big hot topic of power to liquids. So renewable electricity converted into liquid fuel. These are amazing technologies. They've come an awfully long way. But as Chris was saying, we have to make these investable business cases. And that's really where our role applies in the Boeing teaming relationship. We're responsible for the feasibility studies, we're responsible for the project development plans, and creating that investable project. And then, of course, it's important that we go to market and we find the capital, which, as you rightly say, is enormous at this stage. There's still a lot of risk in the business. That's why we're particularly pleased that Boeing have stepped up and demonstrated that people need to be enabling this industry. They've got to accept an element of risk, but we can quite clearly see this is the most important pathway to begin that major process of decarbonizing the industry.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, there's a geographic component of this, and I think the feedstocks are going to be important. We're going to have we envision multiple feedstocks being used to produce these fuels, and those feedstocks are being developed with technologies like Sky Energy or Lanza Tech, Jennifer's company, and I think we're going to have multiple ways to do that. But that may depend on the continent even, in terms of what's an acceptable feedstock, what might the geography enable as an abundant feedstock, what kind of industries and economies can we help by creating a feedstock industry? And then, it's going to be about the carbon emissions improvement that we get out of those fuels. And so rightly, as Philippe said, that feedstock has to be viewed as renewable. So we've been working with RSB for a long time. We think RSB is a way to get good independent validation of the sustainability of that. And then we have to make sure that between the feedstock, the production process, and the distribution, we're actually getting a highly reducing carbon emissions out of that fuel. And as you know, airplanes are qualified now for 50-50 operations. That would be a great next problem to have, to be flying that way every day on 50-50, and then we've got to do the work that says when we get to the point where we're 100% flying on that, what's that going to mean for airplanes and engines and things like that?
I think you're absolutely right, Chris, because, for example, in this region of the world, you really cannot talk about biofuels on a grand scale. We will talk about a little bit further down the road in terms of what types of biofuels can be produced here, but that's a very important point. Now, the industry is all of a sudden taken off, right? Sustainable aviation fuel is on every single newspaper, every single announcement these days. And there have been some key announcements, mandates in Europe, some other subsidies in the US. We're trying to get to a point of producing 10% sustainable aviation fuel of the supply or of the demand by year 2030. How do you see this happening? I mean, are we going to get there? Is that feasible?
I'm bullish for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's a lot of interest in it, obviously driven by carbon emission reduction. I also think you need to look at some of the related industries outside of aviation and what may be happening to them. It's pretty clear that automotive is seeking to get more electric. If you look at the oil and gas industry, they're pivoting to become energy companies. And so, and then if you look at the financial industry, they're motivated to help finance some of these transitions to a greener economy. And so some of the macro dynamics, I think are going to be helpful actually to the scale up of this industry. And then you get to the government incentivizing policies, and I would use the word tax incentives as opposed to subsidies. And I think if we look at, say California in the United States, where a lot of this fuel is made today, you can point to the enablement of the low carbon fuel standard and the incentives around that. And I think that's what you see starting to occur around sustainable aviation fuel. And I know, at least in the United States, the whole industry really got behind this idea of a blender's tax credit. And I think there was some other important components to that, though. One was that it was feedstock agnostic. It only mattered that you got the carbon emissions reduction out of the fuel. Obviously, it needed to be sustainable. But that was very important, and it was focused on aviation. It was focused on this hard-to-abate sector of aviation, and so everybody got behind it because we think it's a way to draw capital to the problem and have it scale faster. And it was very aligned with the White House's objective in the grand SAF challenge of getting to kind of 3 billion gallons or so in the United States by 2030.
So I'll just add to Chris's points. I think we see this as being realistically ambitious. Sky Energy is very deliberately technology and feedstock agnostic. We can see that there are multiple pathways, and the aim is to as we've said, make these investable cases. So as we look at the kind of volumes that are going to be required and the capital that's going to be required, the mandate versus incentive discussion is a very interesting one. Mandates obviously serve a very important purpose. The challenge is making sure it's not overly punitive, that it can actually structurally change an industry. So to see a blend of these two, I think is very important. And also, as we see clearly this attraction from California's approach, the challenge really to other governments around the world is to make sure that they also have programs in place that can support the development of this industry. Otherwise, actually, what's going to happen is that fuel, and no pun intended, but that fuel is going to flow to California. And I think there's an opportunity there for other governments now to see the development opportunities and put in place some kind of hybrid, really, of an incentive and a mandate approach.
One last point, Alejandro. I think if we look at the demand signal that you mentioned in the beginning, I think that we're approaching 10 billion US gallons of demand between, if you kind of aggregate all the announcements that airlines have made. So I think maybe if you'd gone back 5 or 6 years, there was more talk about the demand side. I think the demand side, you're starting to see very strong signals on the demand side. Now we've got to work the issues of the economic scale up and adoption on the supply side, actually. And so I think we should be encouraged by that, and I think the airlines deserve a lot of credit for starting to signal that demand, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for looking to renew their fleets in a very difficult time to get more fuel-efficient fleets. And I sort of feel like the airlines don't get enough credit for what they are doing to renew fleets, pursue operational efficiency, and then help signal the demand for sustainable aviation fuel.
So we were having a short conversation before coming in here, and I think this leads to this next question, which is about, what you hear is that the price is still very expensive, right? And we've talked about tax incentives, we've talked about mandates, and these will help in perhaps, bringing the price to a better or a more realistic level. But what other strategies can you give us that may be able to help in supporting the industry and moving it forward?
Yeah, I'll chip in on that one. My background is airline. I worked for Cathay Pacific for 30 years. And so the discussion around price is a very sensitive one. We understand that. Margins are very thin. It's a very capital-intensive industry. But the volumes that we're talking about today are very, very small. And the impact actually on a fuel procurement invoice it's a rounding error at the moment. So I think what we've been very pleased to see is these airlines that have acknowledged that really, yes, we understand that it's going to be expensive for the time being. These are difficult to scale technologies, difficult to handle feedstocks. But it is very important that we see how this evolves into the bottom line for the airline. And right now, the pricing component is really so de minimis, it allows airlines to step up and enable. And as, of course, we enable, as we get to scale, those technologies will inevitably result in a reduced operating cost, and hopefully, of course, the ambition being that it reaches a parity with fossil jet fuel.
And I think, the other thing I think is the blender's tax credit I mentioned earlier. I think the case studies I often hear are, analogies to solar and how solar scaled up, or or how wind power scaled up. And I think if we went back and looked at sort of the beginnings of those, we were talking about some of these similar issues. And then, you know, I think we got to get them started and then let the scale and the demand sort of take care of itself on where the price settles out. But I think, you know, back to the demand, I just think about the last couple of weeks, Alejandro. I mean, Rolls-Royce, 100% fuel flight, United, 100% fuel flight, Etihad, most sustainable flight, Alaska Airlines with the eco demonstrator. I mean, you know, I think the demand signals, BA and the work that they've done with their sustainable fuels flights, I mean, the demand signals are there.
So we're in the middle of the Dubai Airshow. We're in the UAE. The UAE is a very large aviation market. How do you see the topic of SAF evolving here? There has been a lot of talk. There's a national committee that has been established to promote and develop both low-carbon aviation fuels and sustainable aviation fuels. But from your perspectives, how do you see this topic here in the UAE?
Well, we see some really exciting work being done by the SRBC. I think some of these pathways, these biomass generation projects are absolutely world-leading. And as we said at the outset, it's very important that we understand it's all pathways, it's all technologies. And so I think the development and the investment that has been made in the research in the Gulf states is very, very welcome. Clearly, we're going to need to get to scale. As we move into power to liquids, for example, the big pinch point right now is the production of renewable electricity. Well, this is one of the greatest areas of the world for a renewable solar source. And so we can really begin to see the potential of large volumes of SAF being produced where the renewable electricity is going to be most cost-effectively produced.
And I was just going to add, Alejandro, I don't know that you introduced yourself, so I think you should introduce yourself and sort of answer that own question, because I think you're doing some cutting-edge work here on that in the Middle East, so maybe you should answer that.
You are absolutely right, Chris. I did forget to do that. My name is Alejandro Rios. I am the director of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium, and we are working on developing halophytic biomass, which is these plants are able to grow in desert sand, and we irrigate them with full-strength seawater. So we are using the strengths of the region, salt water and desert sand, to produce biomass that can later be turned into a sustainable aviation fuel. Now, having said that, you know, this is going to take time. It certainly is a very important project for the world, for the region, of course, but for the world as well. But it will take time, and so there needs to be patience, and people are looking to have the fuel now, very, you know, as soon as possible. So you, Philippe, you brought out this very important point. There's a lot of investments. The UAE is an energy powerhouse, both on the fossil fuel side of things, but also on the renewable side of things. There have been numerous investments in producing low carbon energy. So I think this power to liquids dimension takes on a very important, I guess, dimension here in the UAE. So what are the next steps for you guys? I mean, what is Sky Energy thinking about? What is Boeing thinking about? You know, can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are looking towards the future?
Yeah, absolutely. If I can start, obviously our main focus at the moment is the partnership agreement with Boeing. We see that as a phenomenal enabler and an amplifier of the work that is going on. The building of these investable cases, Sky Energy has currently got 5 different projects underway at the moment, both in Europe and the United States. These include a number of different technology pathways. LanzaTech is a very important partner for us in the US. Boeing have stepped up in order to actually be an off-taker and an investor in that project, with our partner Alaska Airlines as well. So we're beginning to see these really interesting ecosystems beginning to form. And our aim is to find the replicability of these business cases so that we're able to start to make these more investable, more rapidly, to build capacity and produce the volumes of SAF that we know are required.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I was thinking about your question. We named our sustainability report Sustainable Aerospace Together. And I think the together part is critical. And I think about our partnerships with Sky Energy, or you think about around the world. And these feedstock production process underneath of a enabling government incentivizing policy with an airline partnership or two in the region where there's a lot of demand for travel. And I just think, we're gonna have to develop these all over the world. And, every continent ultimately is going to need sustainable aviation fuel. How we get there on each continent may be a bit different, but that's one of the reasons we partnered. So our view was we need to do the work on our own products to make sure that regardless of when 100% supply is available, our airplanes and engines will know how to handle it. We have work to do there. Second, we use fuel ourselves, so we should be converting our own fuel use to sustainable fuels. It's small compared to an airline, but we should move our own fuel use to more sustainable fuel. And then we've got to be active in the world with people like Philippe, and we've got to be active in trying to do what we can with our capabilities for advocacy, for investment, for partnering, for technical qualification, anything we can do to help catalyze the scale up of this in other locations in the world. We've got to be about that, and so that's how we're approaching it.
So we, a few weeks back, we had the IATA General Assembly made an announcement that is quite a bit more aggressive than the long-term goal that had been established by both IATA and ICAO. And this is to fly net zero by 2050, right? Before we had a long-term goal of reducing the carbon footprint to half of what it was in year 2005. Now we're saying we want to be net zero by 2050, or at least IATA is saying that. We'll see what happens in ICAO's assembly next year. Most likely there's been a push towards net zero all over the world. The UAE is the only Arab state that has come out and said that they want to be net zero by 2050. So what type of pressures do you think that will put into the aviation industry to be even more aggressive and to pursue this net zero, goal?
Yeah, I think the industry, I think people may not realize this, but this was one of the first industries to come together as an industry and have sector goals, including the long-term one that was recently updated to net zero by 2050. So I think the aviation community has always competed on fuel efficiency, and fuel efficiency is good for carbon emissions reduction. And so I think the fact that the goal was updated is great. I think the industry was focused on it naturally anyway, but that helps to align, I think, the industry around it. And then I think the way we're going to get there is, again, back to the fleet renewals that are taking part. I think a lot of the demand for aviation you're going to see over the next couple of decades, much of it will come from replacement with more fuel-efficient air vehicles. And I think the operational efficiency that the airlines pursue every day, on weight or more direct air traffic routings, these are all very important. They're not read about a lot, but they're very important to fuel efficiency. Air traffic management modernization, very important to fuel efficiency. And then scaling up the sustainable fuels, and then lastly, making sure we're investing in those future technologies that may have a place in aviation, but they might be in these early stages of, is it technologically viable? Could we safely certify it? What infrastructure needs to change? We'll work our way through those things, but we need to get after it in the next decade, and the best way to do that is dropping in sustainable aviation fuel on the longer haul routes.
Yep. Philippe, any comments?
I would add that I've experienced Boeing's phenomenal ability to create step change in the industry. And where you see a 20 to 25% fuel efficiency based on all the technologies and the composite materials that go into the creation of these new aircraft, and the leading airlines that, as Chris says, have stepped up to make those investments in those aircraft, it gives me great confidence that we will, while it absolutely is a stretch target from today, we can see the pathway to getting to net zero. So SAF remains Sky Energy's prime focus. We understand it is the most important pathway to begin this process of decarbonization, but we're very excited to see all of these technologies come together with our partners to deliver on that net zero goal.
And then I guess I'd like to come back and talk a little bit more about this power to liquids thing, because it is gaining a lot of steam, specifically in Europe. But as I mentioned before, in this region of the world where we have low-cost energy, where we would be able to produce a very low-carbon, low-cost hydrogen, this gives this region of the world a competitive advantage. And there, of course, are a number of industrial gases that are available here that could potentially provide another feedstock for this process of producing power to liquids. However, there is some concern about using carbon sources that are promoting, if you will, other types of industries. And so how do you see the power to liquids market in Europe, and how do you think this will, come to fruition in different parts of the world?
At the outset of the conversation, we talked about feedstock and true sustainability. There's also the component of absolute carbon reduction. And one of the areas that Sky Energy is really focused on is understanding which technology should be used in which industry to ensure the greatest carbon reduction. And I think that's the analysis that we're going to be performing as we look at Europe and we look at other parts of the world. And clearly, to your point, this part of the world is one in which renewable electricity is very viable. We can see the cost points being appropriate for building the investable business cases and ultimately driving that into liquid fuel production. So again, I think we've got a lot of work to do in this space. With the support of Boeing enabling us to amplify that, I think we stand a very good chance of really helping build that industry in this part of the world.
Yeah, and I think, we talked, you also asked the question about, the price difference of the SAFs we better understand than that one. And I think we'll have to understand what the prices are on that too. That will be that fourth bucket of economic adoption and market adoption. But I think, there's no question that if you could have, a carbon capture capability with a green hydrogen capability and a place to make SAF and a distribution center all sort of co-located, that's going to be great. I think we should all want to pursue that as a downstream path, but it will get down to what I think Philippe says about what's the best use of that as other industries decarbonize also. And so, we have to be working on that pathway too. But it will depend a lot on the inputs, and ultimately it will come down to the life cycle carbon assessment. And I suspect if you really looked at a life cycle carbon assessment right now, it might actually be worse than fossil fuel. So we have to work on how that pathway can be done, cleaner and greener, as they like to say, so that we do get the carbon emission reduction out of it. Then we could be having the economic debate.
I mean, in Europe, there's a lot of talk about these recycled carbon fuels or these renewable fuels of non-biological origin. And the way in which they're thinking about it is a couple of steps forward. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting developments on that space. I think we're running short on time, so do you have any other or any closing thoughts that you would like to share with the people listening?
I think, my closing thought would be, one, to just thank Philippe for being here. The partnership's been long and strong with them, and we know it's going to be great all over the world. But I think one thing we all have to remember is, we're at an air show. I think sometimes when we're in our aerospace world and we talk with one another, it's a little easier to understand some of these things. Maybe we have our own language. I think we have to almost not take for granted that everybody accepts and understands the societal benefits of this industry. The purpose of our company is to protect, connect, and explore our world and beyond. The protect and connect and explore parts we take very seriously. We know there's societal benefits to that. We've seen them on display in the last year and a half, and we've seen the beautiful faces and people hugging one another when they could finally see their families as the transatlantic market opened back up. So we need to make sure that we don't take for granted the societal benefits, and then earn our license to continue to grow more sustainably.
And from a Sky Energy perspective, we are 100% focused on SAF as the most important transitional approach to enable exactly what Chris has described. And fortunately for Sky Energy, the partnership with Boeing, as I said, allows us to amplify this message. And Chris is absolutely right. It needs to be a broad message as communicated to enable people to understand why it's so important to continue the development of the sustainable aviation fuel market.
Thanks for hosting, Alejandro.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Philippe. I think it was a very interesting session, and let's continue to work on this because I think that the future is bright. Thank you very much.
Very good.